Yeah, so we're coming to the end of this series on the White Lotus Sutra. Rich and compelling as it is, and tonight we're going into chapter 10 of the White Lotus Sutra. So in this part, the sutra tells us we can invoke the protection of the Buddha by metaphorically dwelling in the abode of the Buddha, wearing the robe of the Buddha, and sitting on the throne of the Buddha. So this is what we'll be exploring in tonight's talk. This teaching came from the Buddha in that part of the sutra. So this bit I'm going to read is straight from the sutra. And what is the abode of the Tathagata? It is the abiding in compassion to all beings. That is the abode of the Tathagata which we must enter. And what is the robe of the Tathagata? It is the apparel of sublime forbearance. That is the robe of the Tathagata which we must put on. What is the throne of the Tathagata? It is entering into shunyata, the voidness of all things. That is the throne on which we must sit. So preparing to give this talk, it's been quite a time. And it's felt a bit like opening an envelope. And it says, explain the unexplainable. Use words and concepts to describe that which is beyond words and concepts. That which pertains to the enlightened mind. You have 30 minutes. Your time started when you opened this envelope. And I feel tonight there'll be a lot of pauses, which will be important for me, and actually I think important for you to absorb, because it's sort of quite a weighty, important Dharma we're going to be exploring together. And as ever, I've been immensely helped by my friends and my teachers, by so many, to prepare for this talk in lots of different ways, emotionally, practically, artistically even, which you will see. So huge gratitude to many, and especially to Bhante Sangha, who I'm going to quote a lot tonight. I find it so helpful how clear he is and how precise he is. So I'm going to be quoting him throughout this talk. So these are the three we're exploring: the abode, the robe, and the throne. And within this, we're also going to look at what are known as the near enemies of these three. So in my words, far enemies and near enemies. So it's a classic Buddhist concept. A far enemy would be the opposite. So the far enemy of metta would be hatred. That's quite simple. And a near enemy would be, oh, it's a bit close actually. You might be expressing something and thinking you're in the thing, like compassion, and actually you're in a near enemy. So it's a bit sneaky. So those are my words. Now we'll hear from Sangha. So a far enemy is clearly opposite and inimical to the positive quality one wishes to cultivate. Thus, ill will is the far enemy of loving kindness. A near enemy, by contrast, is sufficiently like the desired quality to be mistaken for it. So we're starting with the abode of the Buddha, great compassion for all, awareness of the universality of suffering, and meeting that with metta. So an abode, like what's the definition of abode? It could be where you dwell, where you live. So I'm going to call it home. And Natalia, who is a beautiful artist, has very, very generously done some drawings for tonight. So this is going to be our symbolic representation of home, the abode of compassion. So I'm just going to stick this up. I hope it stays. So how do we enter this abode? How do we dwell in great compassion for all? So what is compassion? When metta, loving kindness, meets suffering, compassion arises. So metta, the Pali, and karuna. Pali or Sanskrit? I don't know, actually. Should have checked that, shouldn't I? Well, there we go. I'm going to assume karuna is Sanskrit, actually. So karuna is what arises when our metta or maitri, which would be the Sanskrit, meets suffering. Karuna, compassion, is a positive emotion. So if we're dwelling in true compassion, it is a positive emotion. Another way of talking about this could be when love meets suffering and is able to stay loving and wise in the face of suffering, well, then this would be compassion. So Bhante says, if you're feeling metta and you call to mind the suffering of other beings, karuna would be your natural response. And a great way to explore this and others, so metta or maitri and karuna, they're two of a set of four of what are called the Brahma Viharas. And Brahma Viharas retreats are run every year at a variety of centres, of retreat centres. So I just really encourage you to at some point book onto a Brahma Viharas retreat because it's such a life-changing thing and it really gets you in touch much more deeply with metta and its expression. So from when I went on a Brahma Viharas retreat, mine was at Tara Loka. A little quote I had written in my notebook. I didn't write who said it, so this is just an anonymous quote from my retreat. Compassion that is strength and gives strength. This is highest compassion. So in my personal experience, often when I meet suffering in the world, often actually what happens to me is I go into fear or aversion. I can easily get overwhelmed by the suffering, and then I can go from overwhelm and bouncing into blocking off from it as like a coping mechanism. And I don't think this is just me. I think this is a very human experience. It's really common to slip into blocking off from suffering or being flooded with it and being really overwhelmed with the suffering. Because all human beings feel a response, a natural human response to suffering. But often we don't know what to do with it because it can feel too big and too much. So you might have heard of this classic, quite helpful model, the sphere of influence and the sphere of concern. So our sphere of concern is often pretty huge, and our sphere of influence is often fairly small in comparison. So it can be helpful to think in those terms. I'll come back to that a bit later. And the reason we slip into these sorts of responses, into the blocking off, into the being flooded, is what's at the root of it all is this classic delusion of self and other. The way we live our lives, thinking that we have a fixed and separate self in here, and we are opposed and opposite to what's out there. And that means, because of that delusion, when we meet suffering in the world, the options can seem quite binary. They can seem like, well, either I have to fix this suffering, or nobody's going to fix this suffering. And that's obviously too much. That's overwhelming. And of course, that isn't how it really is. That isn't true. So Bhante says, it's not easy to feel even a glimmer of real compassion, because in that state, there's no distinction between self and other. One feels for others as for oneself. One does not experience the usual subject-object, self-other dichotomy. So in the Buddha's great compassion, with this deep understanding of interconnectedness, we feel compassion beyond polarization. We feel compassion for the beings that are suffering and for the beings that may be causing that suffering. Compassion is regarded as coordinate with wisdom itself, and hence as being by nature purely transcendental. That was also Sangha Rakshita. So what are the near enemies to compassion? So as well as having some beautiful drawings from Natalia, I also have some wonderful drawings from Aryadasa. So there are two classic near enemies to compassion. One is what is known as sentimental pity. So Sangha Rakshita, when you are compassionate, you feel sorry for others because they're suffering. But if you feel sorry for them without any real basis of metta, then this becomes akin to a sort of contempt. So I can, the word sentimental, I often don't really get what it means. So I thought, okay, let's define it. So sentimental can be defined as an exaggerated and self-indulgent tenderness. So sentimental pity. So hopefully that's evoking this thing. So if there's not actually metta present when you're meeting suffering, you can go into a bit of like a, oh, there, sort of a vibe, you know. And what's happening there is you're taking away that person's karmic agency. You're not recognizing them as a complex being in themselves. You're simplifying them. And I think that this is a method of blocking off. I think that's why we can go into sentimental pity. You sort of glimpse at the suffering and you keep it a bit vague. And you go, oh, well. And because we've got the abode is the image and symbol of great compassion, I thought, well, what could be an image for sentimental pity? And we've gone with a very sad shed. So this is sentimental pity, a near enemy. So you might think you're in compassion, but actually look out for those tones. Are you actually taking in that being? Or and the other near enemy to compassion, which is for sure the one I more recognize, is known as horrified anxiety. So this is what I can often get into if I watch the news, a spiral of horrified anxiety. So I wanted the image for this to be a ditch in the road. You know, you always hear about, oh, these ditches in roads, they're terrible, terrible places to be. Well, great. Horrified anxiety, the ditch in the road. So in this near enemy, we're staring at suffering. We're not glimpsing at it, we're staring at it. We're getting overwhelmed by it, and we are ourselves entering into a state of suffering. And actually, we're just increasing the amount of suffering going on. We're increasing the amount of dukkha going on. And an interesting thing is you can go from a near enemy to a far enemy. So potentially you could be in an experience of something like horrified anxiety. And the aversion that can come from that experience is you could actually push off into absolute aversion and hatred potentially. So depending on the sort of content that's arising in your experience, whether it's someone you know or something through the news or whatever it is possible, because we think we have a self we need to protect. So we can go into this thing of wanting to protect the self. And sometimes it can get quite sharp and outward, and that's sort of some hatred can arise. It's good to watch out for that, because an example would be horrified anxiety can lead to outrage. And then people can think, oh, this is, righteous indignation, outrage, this isn't acceptable. And that's a natural human stage. But, as Buddhists, what are we going to do next to get into compassion? There is actually something that needs to come in the middle. So, the very important Dhammapada verse, not by hatred are hatreds ever pacified here in the world. They are pacified by love. This is the eternal law. So suffering, it can't be elevated by unskillful mental states. No matter how great the suffering, unskillful states aren't going to help us. So it's natural that they will arise in our being, but as practitioners, what do we do next with that? The abode of the Buddha does not include unskillful behavior. And of course, that's the ideal, but how can we aspire towards that? So we're wanting to dwell in the home or the abode of compassion, not in the shed of sentimental pity, and not in the ditch in the road of horrified anxiety. And I was thinking of just lots of examples in my life and thinking, have I ever been in actual compassion? Am I always in one of these guys, It was really good to reflect on, thinking, really helpful to have been studying and reflecting on compassion, this thing about self and other. Has there been a time where I've been able to get myself out of the way? So I think I have maybe once. Here's a go at a story that I recalled. I thought, I think actually something did happen there. And it's because I turned to help from the Buddha. I think that's what was important there. And that was a good lesson for me in reflecting on this. So a little story. Yeah, so I was on retreat at Ratnaloka. And somebody on the retreat had gotten into a particularly complicated and difficult scenario with somebody else. And I was aware of a lot of this. And it was the last night of the retreat. This had been quite a big theme over the week. And then it was the last night. I was sitting on one half of the shrine room in the final puja, and this lovely person was in the opposite half. And I could just see that she was just crying and crying and crying through the puja, and my heart was just breaking for her. And I felt a bit of me go into, what was it? It was a bit like, I was feeling into these emotions. I think there was probably a little bit of like aversion. Oh no, try and do the puja, like, try and almost block that off or something. And I thought, well, no, I'm not going to do that. And then I went into a bit of, how could I help her? How could I help fix this, So thinking of things I could try and do. Like I say, it was a very complicated scenario. I was thinking, I could talk to this person and da-da-da-da-da. And then I thought, no, this isn't about you. That's not relevant either. And then it was like, could I just much more just ground in my body? And there's this beautiful Buddhist word, anukampa, which means to tremble with. And that's often what's used in Pali scriptures when they're talking about compassion, actually, is to tremble with. So actually, could I just feel what I was feeling and sense what I was sensing and just be in that state? And then as the puja was coming to a close, and just send metta, I should say, as well. So I just started doing metta bhavana for her. That's what I ended up doing. And as the puja came to a close, I thought, I'll ask the Buddha, what could I do, actually? So I just asked the Buddha, and what ended up coming from that was, as the puja ended and people left, I just quietly went round and just held her. I didn't say anything. And then she just cried into my hair, and I just held her for a while. And that's all I needed to do, was just sort of let her know she was loved in some way. And it didn't have to be a big thing or a loud thing or anything. It just needed to be a bit of being held. Because that's sometimes always, isn't it, just a hand on your shoulder or something, or just a bit of like, just a little squeeze. It's just like, it can just be really little moments, but you're just letting someone know that, you're not alone, actually. So what I learned from that is ask the Buddha, actually, when you're in that pickle, and you're like, what do I do? And your self is getting in the way again and again, because it often does that, the old self. How can you get yourself out of the way? Well, ask the Buddha. So Bhante says, we develop karuna in order to motivate ourselves actually to relieve suffering, to help those you can. So that thing of the sphere of influence and the sphere of concern, I was playing with that a bit and thinking, what about the sphere of care? Because I find that a much more heart-opening phrase, like, I just really care, actually. And within that sphere of care, who could I actually help? Because we all have people in our lives we actually can make a difference to. What conditions in my life will allow me to keep being able to actually help? And something to reflect on is, when you practice the metta bhavana, do you have a tendency to pick people who are all doing fairly well? Or do you have a tendency to pick people who are suffering? It's useful just to think a bit about that. Because actually, there might well be a leaning one way or the other. And if you're often picking people who are doing well, it might be that you naturally lean a bit more towards mudita. So that's another one of these Brahma Viharas I mentioned. Mudita can translate as sympathetic joy. I like to translate it as joy in other people's joy. It's a bit simpler. Happiness in others' happiness. And if actually you reflected on it, you think, no, I think I often pick people who are having a really hard time. I pick people who are suffering. Well, it might well be that you more naturally lean towards karuna, you lean towards compassion. And once you clock that, you can think, well, maybe I could bring some balance to that. Maybe I can bring more of the other in and let that be a bit more mixed, because we need both of these positive emotions. We need to experience mudita and karuna. And a really helpful, I remember having a real revelation in my GFR group a few years ago. And this mudra was like the mudra for it. And it was this thing of like, I've been living as if I just bounce from joyful states into like despondency and despair and then bounce back again. And actually, life's not like that. It's much more like this. There are difficult, painful, sad things happening. And there are beautiful, heart-opening, joyful things happening. And they all intermingle, actually, if we really pay attention. And I think culturally, it's very accepted that we can get into horrified anxiety. But culturally, it's not so accepted to be happy for other people's happiness and, instead of in envy, and to be joyful for other people's joy. And that's not great, actually. It's important for mudita to be accepted. So we can do that. We can start that, can't we, by letting that be more known. And very helpfully, Ratnavandana, who is a renowned teacher in this movement and who was on that Brahma Viharas retreat I was on, she taught that if you've gotten stuck in horrified anxiety, the ditch in the road, you could purposely move into some mudita because it will help you regain perspective. So if you're in a metabhavana, you're in a stage, someone's having an awful time, and actually you've ended up slipping into the near enemy of compassion, you're getting overwhelmed, well, maybe you could think of a different memory of that friend and bring it back into balance a bit more. So it is okay to purposely cultivate a bit of mudita to regain that center of gravity. So some little suggestions from me for practice in this area, the abode of compassion. Start with noticing, well, when you meet suffering, what is your current tendency? Do you block off? Do you drown in horrified anxiety? Something else? What is your current likely tendency? And then when you practice the metabhavana, could you look at that? Could you look at perhaps reflecting on people in your lives who are joyful and have experienced joy and letting that mudita arise for them? And the opposite, if actually you rarely bring into mind consciously in meditation people who are suffering, perhaps try that gently and see how that is. In fact, no, yeah. I'll take these down. So back into the White Lotus Sutra. The strength of compassion is my abode. The apparel of forbearance is my robe, and voidness is my seat. So let's talk about the robe of the Buddha, what he wears, what protects him, Kshanti. Kshanti is often quoted as being one of the most beautiful words in the sort of Buddhist vocabulary. And it's definitely a word where there isn't one English word that will do it justice as a translation. So I'm going to say a few words so you get like a nice little flavor of what Kshanti is. So patience, forbearance with overtones of love, compassion, tolerance, acceptance, and receptivity. And I would say patience and forbearance are the most common translations you'll come across. And Kshanti is known as the antidote to anger. So, another beautiful image from Natalia. So the Buddha's robe, the robe of Kshanti. So in Buddhism, each Buddha world, each universe has its own name. Ours is known as the Saha world, the world of endurance, because there's a lot to be endured in this world. So to practice Kshanti, you need a lot of will and effort. It is a training for wisdom, to be tolerant in the face of difficulty, challenging us and our self-clinging. We live in a deluded way, as we've said, this instinctive thought that we're separate and fixed. And because of that delusion, we are constantly trying to protect it by pushing away things that threaten us or seem to threaten us and grasping for things that enhance us or seem to enhance us. So one of my favorite stories from the Pali Canon, the Buddha was walking along and he encountered somebody who for some reason was not best pleased with the Buddha, in fact, very annoyed. And he started to hurl abuse at him, shouting loads of mean stuff at the Buddha. And the Buddha didn't say anything. He just waited for this man to finish. And when he finished, he said, "Is that all?" And taken aback, the man replied, "Yes, that's all." And then the Buddha said, "Let me ask you a question. Suppose one day a friend brings you a present, but you don't want to accept it. If you don't accept it, to whom does it belong?" "Well, if I won't accept it, it belongs to the person who was trying to give it to me." Well, you have tried to make me a present of your abuse, but I decline to accept it. Take it, it belongs to you. Kshanti. So how can we practice Kshanti? Oh, well, in the Saha world, there's lots of ways. The sort of traditional, I believe the traditional list is, first of all, nature. So this could be through the weather, insect bites. And that is a good one. I took that seriously. When I'd get an insect bite, I'd try so hard not to itch it. And just Kshanti. And Shanti Deva, sort of different to this particular series, but Shanti Deva from the Bodhicharya Vatara, he talks about training ourselves through mosquito bites. Don't itch them. This is a training. And then, so it's like you could call that our preliminaries to get going with Kshanti. And then next up is our own body. So our body, as it ages and becomes ill, and lets us down. And I started to think, it's not letting us down, it's doing its best, actually. But what can we do to have some Kshanti for the body? And then the next level up, of course, is other people. Another little bit from this chapter 10 of the White Lotus Sutra, where clods, sticks, pikes, or abusive words and threats fall to the lot of the practitioner. Let them be patient, thinking of me. You might remember from the talk 2 weeks ago, Bodhisattva Never Direct, who was having all sorts of abuse hurled at him, and he sort of got to a safe distance, and then he could carry on with what he was up to. And I was thinking, between that and this guy hurling abuse at the Buddha in the Pali Canon, you can't judge your own actions based on the behavior of others towards you. You know, all sorts of reactions and responses can happen towards you, even if you're the Buddha. So I just think, don't judge yourself based on others' responses. Do you see what I mean? Oh. Got a long quote from Bhante in a seminar. And when he's in seminar, you know, it is just him with a group of practitioners in the early days talking in a particular way. So it's quite a different vibe. It's quite long, so I'm just considering, but I think let's have it. What do you reckon? Yeah, great. Bhante in seminar. When you are being kind and compassionate, you are not just thinking of other people. You are also thinking of yourself, because nothing could trouble your mind more than anger and hatred. If you are able to keep your mind free from anger and hatred by practicing Kshanti, you are not only benefiting others, you are also benefiting yourself tremendously by maintaining your own inner peace and tranquility and harmony. There's no excuse for not practicing Kshanti, because the maintenance of our inner tranquility is so important, and of course others are benefited too. So how important this virtue is. It benefits you and it benefits others. How foolish, therefore, it must be to give way to anger which harms and upsets you, sometimes even more than it upsets other people, if anything. Other people are sometimes really hard, you know. If you get angry with them, they just shrug their shoulders and go away. But you can't go away from yourself. You are left with it. You are stuck with your anger. You are left steaming, left to stew in your own juice. There is a traditional list of 11 benefits which accrue from the practice of metta, and one of them is that you sleep happily. The angry person can't even get to sleep sometimes. They're kept awake by their own anger. But the loving and kindly person has a good, sound sleep. Oh. So, I hear you ask, what's the near enemy of Kshanti? Indifference. So the definition of indifference, a lack of interest, concern, or sympathy. This is the near enemy of tolerance. And if the robe is Kshanti, then wearing a bin bag must be the near enemy of indifference. So we want to wear the robe and not the bin bag. So a little bit about indifference. In our Noble Eightfold Path, this path of vision and transformation, you might remember that emotion is like the volume dial of our transformation. It's what gives us energy and vitality in the path. So if your emotion dial is turned down low, well, then your path of transformation will be weak. A bit meh. I can't give that quite a meh, you know? Not much will transform if you're just living in indifference. And you know, that classic thing, peace is a fire, which is something Bhante would say. And energy, like the Dhammapada has all these beautiful verses on energy. So here is one. Whoever is energetic, recollected, pure in conduct, considerate, self-restrained, of righteous life and mindful, the glory of such a one waxes exceedingly. So let there be energy, vitality, aliveness, not indifference. How can we bring that flavor into our Kshanti, into our patience to other people, to ourselves? So in terms of suggestions for practicing Kshanti, remember that list: nature, our own body, other people. Look out for when you have been offended. What an opportunity to practice Kshanti if you feel offended. When somebody does not do what you want or says something that you do not like, when an institution or political leader does things that you do not agree with, a chance for Kshanti. So, the throne of the Buddha, Shunyata. This is the most impossible bit of the talk. I love this throne. I love that the three jewels are above it. I think that's gorgeous. So this is the most impossible bit, because here we are using words and concepts to describe absolutely the very fabric of reality that is absolutely beyond words and concepts. And I've heavily relied on Maitri Siddhi to have a go at saying something about this. And, of course, Sangha Rakshasa. So, Shunyata is no kind of substance or thing, not even a metaphysical or transcendental thing. And we have to appreciate that language compels us to speak about it as though it was. In speaking about Shunyata, we have to do continual violence to language. And when we stop doing violence to language, when we start taking what we say about Shunyata literally, then we are no longer speaking about Shunyata. So here's my attempt at a nutshell. So a nutshell of what Shunyata is. Our true nature is change, and the true nature of everything is change and flow. So the classic image of Shunyata is the blue sky, the expansive blue sky. Shunyata is the same as the lakshana of insubstantiality. So if you ever wondered that, it's the same. Very good. Helpful, yeah. So this thing of there being, you know, this thing of, I think this is how Atra puts the three lakshanas. So things change, impermanence. There are no things, insubstantiality. This hurts, dukkha. Very helpful. There are no things because there are no fixed or separate things. Everything is interconnected. So Shunyata is expressing the same truth as this lakshana. It's also the same as that beautiful wooden plaque there, which is expressing the formula of conditioned co-production. So if you ever wondered that, yes, it's the same thing. Great. Shunya means zero. So the literal meaning of Shunyata is emptiness. So in the Heart Sutra, which I imagine everyone in the room has likely heard, and if you haven't, you will soon, you hear this chanting and you hear this word emptiness. And my visceral reaction to that word is quite negative. I don't like the word emptiness. The good news is that is just one translation of this word. So you could also translate shunyata as openness, fullness, potential, mystery. So pick a word that works for you and has a heart-opening response, and let that be your translation for shunyata if emptiness does not suit you. Although it's worth saying, it's this thing about it's empty of our ideas, it's empty of our concepts. So it's pointing at something, the word emptiness. But I think day to day it might be helpful to use a different word. In the Tantra, shunyata is known as the great bliss. So it is a good thing, guys, okay? And in Padmasambhava's skull cup, it is brimming with amrita, the nectar of the deathless, shunyata. So if you ever get in a pickle, if you ever go into a bit of a nihilistic pit of despair, if you're reflecting in this area, just know that, I've probably gone a bit wrong, because actually, shunyata, reality, it's the nature of beauty, interconnectedness, and spiritual friendship. So if your heart is not opening, it's okay. Things might have gone a bit wrong. Your friends will pull you out of it. Ask friends for help. Get recentered. Have another go another time. So if we want to sit on the throne of shunyata, really, we need to be really close to enlightenment to truly do this. If not enlightened, can't say a word anymore. So this was interesting in terms of near enemies, because really, there'll be millions of near enemies because of how deluded we are. So I think that most of the time, we're going to be in the near enemy of this. If not, well, yeah, most of the time is fair. So we went with a wobbly stool of delusion. And, stools can be all right, but a wobbly one's a bit perilous, isn't it? So if you're falling over, ask the Buddha for help or ask your friends for help. The good news is, if we keep practicing, we will just start to understand shunyata with our heart mind. So in a much deeper, more kind of visceral way, a way that's beyond words and concepts. And that understanding through our practice means we will stop acting in such deluded ways. We'll become more and more content, more and more compassionate, and more patient. So all of this flows together. These three concepts are very much the same. It's just a way of exploring them. A quick thing to say. So we're all deluded. Fine. Sometimes, though, there can be confusion, which is different to delusion. So confusion, I think that often in areas of our lives, we can let them be a bit vague and a bit confused, because it can be a bit of a defense mechanism against the bright light of truth and reality. So if you've got an area in your life that you purposely allow to be a bit chaotic, shrouded in obscurity, you sort of want to be a bit confused about it. Actually, it's quite helpful to be confused because it's easier than really facing something. Again, maybe ask friends for help in that area. Maybe try and change, because keeping our lives confused isn't going to help with practicing towards these ideals. So a suggestion from me, I thought this is really funny, to try and give a suggestion to try and practice towards shunyata. But really, it's just practice. That's the good news. It is just practice the Dharma. But if you wanted something a bit more specific, it's this thing of direct experience. So when you're meditating, you're not thinking about breathing. You are directly experiencing the sensations in your body, in your lungs, in your breath, in your stomach. How can you bring direct experience to more and more of your life? And that is a way in. So we're coming to the end. Something from the White Lotus Sutra, which I think is very heartening. I'm going to shorten this a little bit. This is the Buddha speaking in the sutra. All whosoever who, after my death, shall hear this Dharma parayaya, and after hearing it, even a single stanza, joyfully accept it, even with a single thought of acceptance, to those I predict their destiny to supreme and perfect enlightenment. So if you've come to any of these Sangha Night series and heard even a little stanza from the White Lotus Sutra, how heartening is this? I just found that very lovely. And within that chapter 10 that I've been sort of working from, there's this lovely moment from the Buddha. They shall have their head stroked by the hand of the Tathagata. Those practitioners who, after my death, shall believe, read, write, honor this Dharma Parayaya and recite it to others. Good. So the final thing, we need to practice Kshanti so we can keep up a life of practice. We need to remember we're not doing this alone. We are profoundly not alone. We practice together. A life of practice is what leads us to be purified of delusion in the fires of shunyata, and therefore to be in the full flow of true great compassion. So we need to put on the Buddha's robe of Kshanti so we can sit on the throne of shunyata, and that is how we will truly find home.